Alex bought this house for a song. At least, that's what he told himself whenever another doorframe fell off or when rusty water started dripping from the kitchen faucet. The house was old, the kind they call having character, and by character, they usually meant creaking floorboards, drafts from nowhere, and eternal cobwebs in the corners, no matter how much you cleaned. But it stood on the outskirts of a quiet New England town, far from the city noise that had worn Alex down over years of working in a cramped Boston apartment. Most importantly, it had a spacious office with a huge window overlooking the backyard. For him, a freelance graphic designer, it was the perfect place. The backyard was overgrown, gradually merging into a dense wall of forest that seemed to be just waiting for the right moment to swallow this small island of civilization. During the day, it looked picturesque. At night, it was a completely different story. The night here was thick, inky, and undiluted by the light of street lamps. The only source of light in the office was his monitor, casting cold reflections on the desk and walls. The first time he saw it was on his third night after moving in. It was around 2 in the morning. Alex was finishing an urgent project, and his eyes were already heavy with fatigue. Leaning back in his chair, the designer rubbed his temples and glanced absent-mindedly at the window. In the dark glass, like a black mirror, his room was reflected. The outlines of the desk, the flickering screen, his own faint silhouette, and something else. Right in the center of the glass, at his eye level, the reflection of a smile appeared for a split second. It wasn't his smile. Alex himself sat with a serious, tired expression. This one was wide, unnaturally wide, bearing teeth that seemed too straight, too white. It just hung in the reflection and then vanished. Alex blinked. He must have imagined it. Of course, he'd imagined it. A combination of fatigue, the stress of moving, and the play of light from the monitor. Chuckling at his own thoughts, the young man stood up and walked to the window, peering into the impenetrable darkness outside. Nothing. Only the rustling of leaves somewhere deep in the woods. Drawing the curtains, he returned to his work, trying to forget the strange vision. For a few days, everything was calm. Alex was busy unpacking boxes, doing minor repairs and working, having convinced himself that the incident was just a figment of his imagination. New places always seem a bit strange until you get used to them. But a week later, it happened again. He was working late again. The deadline was looming, and coffee was no longer helping. At one point, frozen in front of the screen while contemplating a design detail, his gaze unfocused and drifted to the window. The curtains were open, and he saw it again. The smile was there in the reflection. This time, the vision lingered for a couple of seconds longer. It was clearer. A perfect, predatory curve of the lips. It seemed to have gotten closer. If the first time was a vague outline, now it had a sense of depth, as if someone was standing right behind him. Alex's heart skipped a beat. He spun around. The room was empty. The only sound breaking the silence was the hum of his computer tower. Slowly turning back to the window, the designer saw only his own reflection, a pale face with eyes wide with fear. Logic desperately tried to take over. It's a reflection. It's created by the light from the room. If there's no one in the room, there's nothing to be reflected. Maybe it was some kind of flaw in the glass? Old, warped glass that distorted the light from the monitor in a peculiar way? Alex moved closer, touching the cold surface with his fingers, running them over it, searching for imperfections. The glass was smooth, ordinary. He turned on a back porch light. A bright yellow lamp flooded a small patch of the overgrown lawn, but beyond it, at the edge of the forest, the darkness only grew thicker and more impenetrable. No one. Alex couldn't work anymore that night. He drew the curtains tightly, checked the lock on the front door 3 times, and went to bed, but sleep wouldn't come. The image of that silent, eerie smile hanging in the darkness was seared into his mind. It was devoid of all mirth. There was no joy or friendliness in it. It was the smile of pure, undiluted malevolence. The smile of someone who knows something about you that you don't know yourself. Someone who is waiting patiently. The next morning, in the light of day, everything seemed foolish. A normal house, a normal window. Alex even laughed at his own nighttime paranoia. But as dusk began to fall, he caught himself casting anxious glances at the office window. He turned on all the lights, even in the rooms he wasn't in, trying to banish the oppressive feeling. He decided to go to bed early to avoid being alone with the night's darkness in that office. But work was work. The project had to be submitted. Around 11 at night, with a heavy sigh, Alex sat down at his desk. His first instinct was to draw the curtains, but something stopped him. He couldn't give in to stupid fears in his own home. He had to prove to himself that it was all just a game of his imagination. After working for about an hour, completely absorbed in the process, he had almost forgotten his fear. Finishing another stage, he let out a satisfied breath and leaned back in his chair. And he looked up at the window. The smile was there. It was waiting for him. And this time it was so close that it seemed about to touch the glass from the other side. It was huge, occupying almost the entire central part of the window. The details were terrifyingly sharp. The creases of the corners of the lips, the glint of perfectly straight teeth. It no longer looked like a reflection. It looked as if on the other side of the glass, in the absolute darkness, a glowing, mocking smile was hovering all by itself. Alex froze, unable to move. His breath caught in his throat. He stared at it, and if it had eyes, stared back at him. At that moment, he understood two things. First, he was not going crazy. Second, and far more terrifying, something was happening in his house for which there was no rational explanation. And it knew he was here. Time stretched into a thick, sticky molasses. Seconds felt like minutes. Alex couldn't look away, paralyzed by terror. The smile hung in the darkness, motionless and all-consuming. And then slowly, unbearably slowly, it began to dissolve. It didn't vanish with a snap as before, but seemed to melt away, disintegrating into particles of darkness until nothing was left but the image burned onto his retinas. In that same instant, the stupor broke. Alex recoiled so sharply that his wheeled office chair shot backward and toppled over with a crash. Scrambling to his feet, fumbling with his limbs like a newborn fawn, he bolted from the office. He didn't look back. He just ran, slamming the door behind him with such force that the old house shuddered. Without stopping, he ran to his bedroom on the second floor, slammed that door too, turned the flimsy lock, and in a panic, began to move the heavy oak dresser to barricade the entrance. Only when the dresser hit the door with a dull thud did Alex allow himself to slide to the floor, breathing heavily, clutching his head in his hands. His heart hammered against his ribs like a caged bird. He didn't sleep that night. He sat in the corner of his bedroom, wrapped in a blanket, and listened. Every creak of the floorboards, every groan of the old wood, every rustle of leaves outside the window seemed to herald something terrible. He listened for footsteps that never came, waited for a knock on the door that never followed. The silence was as deafening and hostile as that smile. With the first rays of dawn that pierced through the slats of the blinds, a fragile sense of relief came. The sunlight felt like a life-saving disinfectant, driving out the nightmares. But the fear hadn't gone away. It had merely receded, cowering under the onslaught of day, but it remained there, a cold, heavy knot in his stomach. Alex avoided the office all day. The thought of opening that door made him feel nauseous. An attempt to work at the kitchen table failed. He couldn't concentrate. Every few minutes, his gaze would involuntarily drift to the hallway that led to that part of the house. He had to do something. Just sitting and waiting for the next night was unbearable. Mustering all his willpower, Alex went out into the backyard. The day was clear and windy. The forest rustled with 1,000 voices. He walked up to the office window and examined it closely from the outside. Ordinary glass, a bit dirty. A wooden frame in need of paint. Nothing. No tracks, no devices, no hidden projectors or speakers. Walking around the house, he scrutinized the ground. The grass under the window was flattened, and the earth seemed slightly disturbed, but that could have been raccoons or the deer that sometimes came out of the woods. There was nothing that could explain what he had seen. A rational explanation was slipping away, leaving only the bare, irrational truth. What he saw was real. Back in the house, Alex sat down with his laptop in the kitchen and started searching. Strange reflections in windows, visual hallucinations in the dark, paranormal phenomena in New England. For hours, he browsed ghost forums, psychology articles, and local legends. He found hundreds of stories about apparitions, poltergeists, about shadows in the corners of rooms. But none of them were like his case. No one described this specific, disembodied, mocking smile that appeared in a window and got closer and closer. His fear was unique. He was alone with this. As the sun began to set, the icy knot of panic started to grow in Alex's chest again. He would not go into the office. No, he decided to work in the living room. He didn't just close the office door, he propped it shut with a chair, as if that could stop something non-corporeal. He turned on every light in the house, creating islands of safety in the thickening twilight. His attempt to work failed. The letters on the screen blurred. All his attention was focused on the sounds of the house. And that's when he heard it. Tap, tap, tap. A quiet, distinct tapping. It was coming from the direction of the office. Alex froze. Maybe it was a branch tapping against the side of the house? But there was no wind outside. The rhythm was too measured, too deliberate, as if someone was methodically tapping on the glass with a fingernail. His window. His heart plummeted. He sat, gripping the arms of his chair, not daring to breathe. The tapping continued for about a minute and then abruptly stopped. Silence fell, even more sinister than the sound itself. Alex slowly exhaled. Maybe he imagined it. And then, from behind the closed office door, a new sound emerged. Barely audible. A rustle like a whisper or a chuckle. A low guttural sound that sent shivers down his spine. It was the sound of amusement. A sinister, anticipatory amusement. And Alex understood. It was no longer just outside. It was tapping to get his attention. It was letting him know that the glass barrier was no longer an obstacle. It was in the office, waiting for him. For the second night in a row, he spent without sleep, but this time on the living room sofa, under the blinding light of every lamp in the house. The cheap price he'd paid for the house no longer seemed like a bargain. It seemed like a cost. And Alex was beginning to realize he was paying not just with money. He was paying with his sanity and his peace of mind. And something told him this was only the beginning. On the third day, Alex was a shadow of his former self. 2 sleepless nights and mounting terror had turned his face into a pale mask with dark circles under his inflamed eyes. He moved through the house like a thief, flinching at every creak. The office door remained closed, propped shut with a chair. The very thought of approaching it brought on a cold sweat. He couldn't work, couldn't eat. He was a prisoner in his own home. Run. The thought was obsessive, a lifeline. Just get in the car and drive away. Anywhere. Far away from this damned place, from the window, from the smile. He had already grabbed his keys when another thought, cold and clear, cut through the fog of panic. What if it followed him? What if it wasn't attached to the house, but to him? That idea was even more terrifying than the prospect of staying. It turned the entire world into a potential trap. No, running wasn't an option. He had to understand what he was facing. Knowledge was the only weapon he could imagine. Gathering the last of his courage, Alex forced himself to leave the house. The contrast between his internal state and the peaceful autumn morning was almost surreal. The sun was shining, birds were singing. He got in his car and drove into town. He needed access to information, to history. The town library was the best place to start. The library of the town of Ashworth was an old brick building that smelled of dust, wood, and bookbinder's glue. Behind the counter sat an elderly woman with gray hair pulled into a tight bun and half-moon glasses perched on the tip of her nose. Her name tag read Eleanor Gable. She gave Alex a polite but curious smile. "May I help you, young man? You must be the one who bought the old Blackwood house on the edge of the woods." Her voice was quiet but firm. Alex flinched at the mention of the name. He knew the surname of the people he'd bought the house from, and it wasn't Blackwood. "Yes, that's me. I just wanted to look at the local archives, the property history." He tried to sound as casual as possible. Mrs. Gable looked at him intently over her glasses. "The Blackwood house. It's been a long time since anyone called it that. The families have changed, but for us old-timers, it will always be the Blackwood house. Are you looking for something specific? Just any strange stories or events connected to the place?" Alex forced out. The librarian's expression changed. Curiosity was replaced by caution. "Some stories are best left undisturbed," she said quietly. "That house stood empty for a long time. Not without reason. Please." Desperation broke through in Alex's voice. "I need to know." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment, at his pale face and trembling hands. Finally, she sighed and gestured for him to follow her into the dusty archive room. There was a man, Silas Blackwood. He built that house over 100 years ago. He was an artist, a sculptor, very eccentric. They said he was obsessed with the idea of capturing the purest, most sincere emotion. But he wasn't interested in love or sorrow. He was interested in joy. Or rather, what he considered to be joy. The woman pulled a heavy leather-bound book from a shelf. It was an old-town almanac. Carefully flipping through the yellowed pages, she pointed to a faded photograph. It showed a tall, thin man with burning eyes and a wide smile. A smile that sent a chill down Alex's spine. It wasn't an exact copy of the one he'd seen, but it had the same predatory, unnatural glee. He created strange sculptures, depicting faces and moments of ecstasy, but his works evoked anxiety in people, not joy. There were rumors, very ugly rumors, Mr. Miller. Alex Miller. Mr. Miller. Rumors about how he achieved such realism. About missing vagrants. Nothing was ever proven, of course. And then, one winter night, he just vanished. Disappeared from his house, which was locked from the inside. The police found his workshop full of those gruesome, smiling faces. But he himself was never found. She closed the book. People say his spirit remained in the house. Or rather, his obsession. His thirst to find the perfect smile. Alex stood as if struck by lightning. Blood pounded in his ears. The smile? It was all about the smile. "Thank you," he croaked, and without another word, he rushed out of the library. The drive home felt endless. Mrs. Gable's words echoed in his head. His thirst to find the perfect smile. When he pulled up to the house, the sun was already setting, painting the sky in alarming crimson tones. He got out of the car, and his heart froze. The chair he had used to prop the office door was now standing a few feet away from it, neatly placed against the wall. And the door itself was ajar. A dark gap, both beckoning and terrifying. Trembling, Alex entered the house. Silence. Slowly, step by step, he approached the office and pushed the door open. The room was in twilight, the light from the setting sun barely penetrating the huge window. Everything seemed to be in its place. The desk, the overturned chair. He walked to the desk and saw that his computer was on, the monitor glowing. His graphic design program was open on the screen. And in the center of the canvas, in perfect resolution, was an image. A detailed, photorealistic image of the very smile he had seen in the window. The creases at the corners of the lips, the glint of the teeth, the unnatural curve. It was rendered with a skill he himself was incapable of. And below the image, typed in a simple system font, was a text. One short sentence that completely shattered the remnants of his world. "I like yours the most." Alex slammed the laptop shut with such force that the plastic cracked. The sound echoed through the deathly quiet room. For a few seconds he stood frozen, breathing heavily, and then he was seized by a new kind of panic. Not the kind that makes you run and hide, but the cold, furious panic of a cornered animal. It wasn't just watching. It was studying. It was communicating. It had made its choice. He ran out of the office, but this time not to the bedroom. He burst outside into the twilight and greedily gulped the cool, fresh air. The house behind him seemed like a living, predatory organism, and the office window its all-seeing eye. Thoughts raced through his mind like a flock of frantic birds. What did it want? His smile? What did that even mean? To take it? To copy it? That night, the house changed. There were no more safe places. Before, the evil had been concentrated in the office, but now it had spread throughout the house like an invisible mold. As Alex walked past the mirror in the hallway, for a split second, he thought his reflection smiled at him with that same wide, eerie smile. He recoiled, his heart pounding wildly. But when he looked again, the reflection was normal, frightened. He drew the curtains on every window, closed all the doors, turned on every light, but the darkness seeped in anyway. Whispers could be heard from empty rooms. A quiet laughter that seemed to come from the walls themselves. Once passing by the kitchen, he saw all the knives in the block on the countertop slide out a few inches from their slots, as if in a silent greeting, and then slowly, with a creak, slide back into place. The torture became more sophisticated. It was now personally directed at him. In the morning, Alex went into the bathroom and saw that someone had squeezed toothpaste onto the mirror, drawing a crude but recognizable smiley face. He froze, staring at it, and suddenly a dark shape appeared over his shoulder in the reflection. He spun around, no one. The fear of his own face became almost unbearable. He stopped smiling. He consciously controlled his facial muscles, afraid of even a hint of joy. When his sister video called him, he made up excuses to not turn on his camera. He didn't want anyone to see him. He didn't want it to see him smile. Deprived of sleep, worn out by constant tension, Alex knew he couldn't last much longer. He would either go insane, or the creature would get to him. Running was pointless. He felt it in his gut. The entity was as attached to him as it was to the house. There was only one way out: to fight back. But how do you fight something that isn't physical? The answer was in the past. In Silas Blackwood. Mrs. Gable had mentioned his workshop. The police had found it. That meant it was somewhere here, in this house. Alex had never thoroughly explored the house. He only used the necessary rooms. Now it was time to look into every dark corner. Driven by desperation, he began his search. He explored the dusty attic, cluttered with junk from previous tenants. He went down into the damp, earthy-smelling cellar with its low ceiling. He tapped the walls, searching for hollow spaces. For 2 days, he turned the house upside down, his paranoia growing with every moment. He constantly felt like he was being watched, that the house was mockingly observing his futile attempts. And then, at the end of the second day, he found it. Deep inside a large closet under the stairs, behind old coats and boxes, was a section of the wall that looked different. The wallpaper was newer, and the baseboard didn't quite line up. He pushed, and the wall gave way, revealing a shallow alcove. And in the alcove, there was a door. An old wooden door with no handle and a massive keyhole clogged with rust. A chill ran down Alex's spine. This was it. He knew it. Behind this door lay the source of his nightmare. Silas Blackwood's workshop. He found an old crowbar in the garage. His hands trembled as he inserted the flat end into the crack between the door and the frame. With the first push, there was a loud crack that sounded deafening in the silence of the house. He pushed harder. The wood groaned, old nails shrieking as they were torn from their homes. Suddenly, the lights throughout the house went out, plunging him into total darkness. Alex froze, hearing only the beating of his own heart. And in that silence, from just behind a door, came a quiet, long sigh, as if someone who had been waiting for a very long time had finally received a guest. The darkness was absolute, thick as velvet. The sigh behind the door faded, leaving a ringing silence that pressed on his eardrums. For a moment, Alex stood frozen, the crowbar in his hand feeling heavy and useless. Instinct screamed at him, run, hide. But where could he run in a house that had become his enemy? Desperation gave him strength. He couldn't back down now. With a trembling hand, he pulled his phone from his pocket. The screen flared to life, snatching a small circle of reality from the gloom. His hands, the crowbar, the old door. He turned on a flashlight. The narrow beam of light pierced the darkness, seeming ridiculously weak. Inserting the crowbar into the crack again, he leaned into it. One more push, accompanied by the loud crack of rotting wood. And the door, torn from its last hinge, crashed inward with a roar, raising a cloud of ancient dust. A smell hit his nose. Stale, with hints of damp clay, turpentine, and something else. A sweet, metallic smell that made his stomach churn. Aiming the flashlight beam into the opening, Alex stepped inside. He had entered a den of madness. The room was small, windowless. The walls were lined with shelves, upon which sat dozens of sculptures, like trophies. Heads, plaster masks, and they were all smiling. Here was the entire palette of Silas's sick obsession, grins frozen in agony, maniacal, wide grimaces, and blissfully, frighteningly serene smiles. In the flickering light of the flashlight, it seemed as if their eyes were following him, and their lips were about to tremble in silent laughter. It was a silent, captive audience of clay and plaster, and Alex was on its stage. In the center of the room stood a large potter's wheel, and next to it, a sculpting stand with the shape of an unfinished work hidden under a burlap sack. But what caught Alex's attention was an old writing desk in the corner. It was covered in a thick layer of dust, but on it, as if left just yesterday, lay a thick leather-bound journal. He approached the desk, each step echoing loudly in the silence. From upstairs, in the living part of the house, came a loud bang, as if someone had overturned a heavy piece of furniture. The house was protesting. It didn't want its secrets revealed. Alex blew the dust off the journal and opened it. The pages were filled with a hurried, almost insane handwriting. He flipped through them, the flashlight beam catching fragments of phrases. Emotion is too fleeting. A more durable vessel is needed. Clay is only the form, but will be the soul. He stopped at an entry, dated almost a year after the journal began. The handwriting here was even more erratic, the letters dancing. I was wrong. It is not about copying. Copy is dead. It must be taken. The essence itself. Pure, undiluted joy at its peak. I have found a way. A ritual dark and ancient as the earth itself. One must catch them off guard, in a moment of sincere, genuine happiness. Laughter is the key. When the soul opens in laughter, it can be separated, sealed away. I tried it on the tramp who asked for a night's lodging. His smile was crooked, full of despair, but even in it, there was a spark. Now it is mine. It lives in the clay. It watches me from the shelf. Alex's breath hitched. So the rumors were true. Silas didn't just kill. He stole souls, emotions. He looked at the grinning faces on the shelves. These weren't just sculptures. They were prisons. He turned a few more pages and came to the last entry. It consisted of only a few lines, written in large, trembling letters. I've found it. The perfect one. The purest. The strongest. But it is too great for clay. It is too bright for this world. It has consumed me. Now I am but an echo of its joy. I have become the smile. I wait behind the glass. I wait for one who will bring me a new worthy. The last word was unfinished. The page was blank. Silas hadn't disappeared. He had transformed. He had become the entity, the smile in the window. His obsession had consumed him, and now bodiless, he was searching for a new, perfect smile to, what? Complete his final masterpiece? Suddenly, the burlap sack covering the sculpture in the center of the room began to slide slowly to the floor, as if pulled by an invisible hand. Alex aimed the trembling beam of his flashlight at it. Underneath was not clay or plaster. It was something dark, porous, like dried wood or stone. The sculpture was unfinished, just a rough oval of a head on a thin neck. But where the face should have been, there was a smooth, terrifyingly blank void, like a canvas awaiting its main feature. And at that moment, from that void, from the very depths of the faceless sculpture, came a quiet, familiar chuckle. And on the wall behind it, Alex's shadow, cast by the flashlight, began to distort. It stretched, bent, and its head turned toward him. And then the shadow on the wall smiled wide, from ear to ear. Paralyzing terror seized Alex. His own shadow, twisted beyond recognition, was mocking him from the cold stone wall. This was no mere play of light. The shadow moved independently, its lips curling into the same predatory smile that had haunted his nights. It was alive. And then the whispering began. It came from everywhere and nowhere. Dry, like the rustle of autumn leaves, it rose from the dozens of plaster and clay faces arranged on the shelves. Every sculpture, every captured emotion, seemed to come to life to greet its master. The whispers merged into a single monotonous drone, seeping under his skin, drilling directly into his brain. They repeated the same word over and over in 100 different ways. Worthy, worthy, worthy. Alex's shadow detached from the wall. It didn't just slide off, it flowed onto the floor like a drop of ink and began to coalesce into a three-dimensional, swirling figure. It was no longer a flat silhouette but a vortex of concentrated darkness, moving slowly toward the faceless sculpture in the center of the room. The entity of Silas was preparing its canvas. At that moment, the icy grip of fear that held Alex shattered, replaced by a searing rage. The rage of a cornered animal with nothing left to lose. He would not be the next head on the shelf. He would not become another frozen emotion in this collection of madness. His gaze darted from the swirling darkness to the faceless form, then to the heavy crowbar he still gripped in his hand. He understood. This sculpture was the anchor, the vessel, the unfinished masterpiece that craved his face, his smile. If he destroyed it, maybe he could sever the connection. A roar came from upstairs. The entire house seemed to shudder in furious protest. Dust rained down from the shelves, and one of the plaster heads fell and shattered on the floor at his feet with a dull thud, its frozen smile breaking into 100 tiny pieces. Without hesitating another second, Alex let out a cry that was a mix of fear and defiance and lunged forward, raising the crowbar over his head. The swirling darkness shot out to intercept him. It had no physical form, but when it touched him, an unbearable cold shot through his body, draining his strength and will. The whisper in his head became a deafening screech. The air in the room grew thick, heavy as water, slowing his every move. Tools on the walls rattled and flew from their hooks, whizzing inches from his head. The house was trying to stop him. But Alex could no longer see or hear anything but his target. The empty, smooth surface of the unfinished sculpture. He put everything he had left into the blow. All his terror, all his hatred, all his desperate will to live. The crowbar whistled through the stale workshop air. The moment the hardened steel touched the dark, porous material of the sculpture, there was a sound like both shattering glass and a death cry. The room was flooded with a blinding, deathly pale light that erupted from the point of impact. Alex was thrown backward by an invisible force. A shockwave tore through the workshop, sweeping all the smiling faces from the shelves, reducing Silas's collection to plaster and clay dust. The light vanished as suddenly as it had appeared, plunging the room back into darkness, broken only by the weak beam of the flashlight from his dropped phone. Alex lay on the floor, stunned, his whole body aching. He slowly lifted his head. The swirling darkness was gone. The screeching in his head had stopped. In the center of the room, cracked nearly in two, the unfinished sculpture smoldered. It seemed to be over. But then he heard a sound that made the blood in his veins run cold. It was a quiet, methodical tapping. Tap, tap, tap. It wasn't coming from the workshop. It was coming from upstairs, from his office. Tapping on the glass, on the huge window that overlooked the backyard. And with each tap, an echo spread through the house, a distant but ever-loudening laugh. A laugh that was no longer tied to one place. A laugh that was now everywhere. Alex realized his terrible mistake. He hadn't destroyed the entity. He had only broken its anchor. He had set it free. And now it was free. Free, hungry, and very, very angry. Lying on the cold, debris-strewn floor of the workshop, Alex listened as his world fell apart. The tapping on the window upstairs grew into deafening, furious blows that seemed to shake the very foundations of the house. The laughter was no longer just a sound. It became a vibration, permeating stone and wood, seeping into his bones. It was the laughter of pure madness, released from its centuries-long prison. He had to get out. Right now. Stumbling, he got to his feet. His phone's flashlight cast long, dancing shadows, turning the wrecked workshop into a nightmarish stage set. He scrambled for the exit, leaping over the remains of the sculptures. Bursting through the opening, he found himself in the pitch-black basement. The path to the stairs upstairs seemed endless. The laughter was right above his head now. Through the ceiling came the crash of moving furniture and the sound of shattering glass. The entity was rampaging through his office, through his house. Alex reached the bottom of the wooden stairs and bolted up them. But the door to the kitchen, which had always been open, was now locked. He threw his weight against it. It didn't budge. He yanked the handle. Locked from the inside. No, 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 he screamed, pounding his fists on the thick wood. In response, low guttural laugh came from the other side of the door. It was so close. Just inches from his face, separated only by a plank of wood. Alex recoiled from the door as if from a hot stove. He was trapped. But then a thought sparked in his panic-addled brain. Another way out. The old cellar door that led directly to the backyard. Heavy, double-leafed, with a rusty bolt. He didn't know if it even opened, but it was his only chance. Turning around, he ran into the depths of the basement, the flashlight beam picking out old jars of preserves, rusty tools, and piles of junk from the darkness. And then he saw it. In the far corner, leaning against the wall, was an old, dust-covered mirror in a carved frame. Running past, he glanced at his reflection and froze. His reflection in the mirror wasn't running. It was standing still, looking right at him. And on its face, slowly, like a predatory flower blooming, was that same smile. What? White-toothed, malevolent. The rules had changed. Now it could be in any reflection. Not daring to look any longer, Alex turned away and rushed to the cellar door. It was just as he remembered, massive wooden doors, set at an angle to the ground, and a huge metal bolt covered in corrosion. He grabbed the cold metal. The bolt wouldn't budge. A hellish racket was coming from the house. The entity was destroying everything in its path. He could hear walls cracking, plaster falling from the ceiling. It was coming for him. He threw his whole body against the bolt, roaring with exertion. The rust gave way with a screech. One more push, and the bolt slid aside with a deafening scrape. Alex grabbed the handles and pushed the doors upward. They were incredibly heavy, weighed down by packed earth and dampness. With creaking hinges, one door lifted, opening a narrow gap through which cold night air and dim, pre-dawn light flooded in. It was enough. He squeezed through the gap, scratching his back and arms, and tumbled out onto the damp, cold grass of the backyard. He was free. He was outside. He lay on the ground, breathing heavily, and looked up at the gray, starless sky. The silence was deafening after the chaos that had reigned in the house. He had done it. He had escaped. Slowly, still trembling, he got up and turned to look at his prison house. And what he saw was the final nail in the coffin of his sanity. The window of his office was shattered, but that wasn't all. In every window of the house on the first and second floors, in the small attic window, right under the roof, a dim, ghostly light was glowing. And in the center of each of those windows, like dozens of malicious eyes, hung the smile. Hundreds of identical, mocking, predatory smiles stared at him from his house. They multiplied, filling every available space. The house was no longer just a haunted building. It had become a face. The face of pure, all-consuming madness. And that face was smiling at him. For a moment, Alex stood frozen, pinned to the spot by the surreal horror. Every smile in every window was identical, each one staring directly at him. The house had transformed into a many-eyed monster, and each of its eye sockets radiated pure, unadulterated malevolence. A peal of laughter erupted from the broken office window, a sound that seemed to make the very trees tremble. That sound broke him out of his stupor. The animal instinct for survival overrode the paralyzing fear. Run. He turned and bolted. Not toward the driveway where his car was parked, but in the only other direction, toward the forest. His feet tangled in the tall, wet grass. His lungs burned from the icy air. He didn't look back, but he could feel the gaze of 100 smiles on his back. He could hear the laughter following him, growing quieter but not disappearing, as if tied to him by an invisible thread. He burst through the wall of trees, branches whipping his face and arms, leaving stinging scratches. The darkness under the forest canopy was almost absolute. He stumbled over roots, fell, got up, and ran again, driven only by adrenaline and the desperate hope of getting away. He needed to get to his car. It was his only chance to get as far away as possible. Making a wide circle, he emerged from the woods onto the road, a few hundred yards from his house. From here, the house looked dark and quiet. No broken windows, no sinister glow, as if nothing had happened. But Alex knew the truth, knew that the house was waiting, watching. He crept toward his car like a thief, constantly looking over his shoulder. The keys trembled in his hand so much that he struggled to insert them into the lock. Jumping inside, he slammed the door and turned the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life, and the ordinary mechanical sound seemed like the most beautiful thing in the world. Without thinking, he floored the gas pedal. Gravel flew from under the tires as the car shot forward. He sped down the narrow country road leading to town. His heart was still pounding somewhere in his throat. He glanced in the rearview mirror to take one last look at the house, and almost screamed. It wasn't the house reflected in the mirror. There, filling the entire small glass space, was the smile. It was looking at him from the mirror, wide, white-toothed, mocking. He jerked his head away, gripping the steering wheel with whitened knuckles. He looked in the side mirror. The same smile. He glanced up at the rearview mirror above him, and there it was again, closer, clearer. It wasn't in the house. It was with him, in the car. Panic threatened to consume him. He nearly lost control, the car swerving toward the shoulder. Forcing himself to look only ahead at the road, at the saving lights of the town that were beginning to appear in the distance, he saw it everywhere. It flickered in the reflection on the sleek hoods of passing cars. It contorted in the puddles on the asphalt. He grabbed his phone to call the police, but when the dark screen came to life, the same grin appeared on it for a split second before the menu showed up. He threw the phone onto the passenger seat as if it were a venomous snake. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. Every reflective surface had become a window for his tormentor. The world had turned into a hall of mirrors, and in every corridor, the same monster awaited him. He drove into town. Sleepy streets, a few streetlights. He should be safe here. There were people here. But as he drove past the main street with its shops, terror gripped him with renewed force. In the dark windows of the bakery, the pharmacy, the antique shop, in every one of them, just like in the windows of his cursed house, hung the smile of Silas. They followed his car, turning as he passed. The whole town was looking at him through the eyes of his enemy. He drove aimlessly, circling the streets, but that only made it worse. He was like a fish in a bowl, being watched from all sides. Pushed to the brink, he swerved sharply to the side of the road and killed the engine. Breathing heavily, he dropped his head to the steering wheel. What to do? Where to go? Who would believe him? They'd lock him in a padded room. And then he remembered. One person who hadn't thought he was crazy. The one who knew the story of the Blackwood house. Eleanor Gable. The librarian. It was a desperate, insane idea to show up on an elderly woman's doorstep in the middle of the night. But he had no other ideas. He found her address in an online directory on his miraculously unglitched phone, trying not to look at the dark screen for longer than necessary. Her house was in a quiet residential neighborhood. Small, well-kept, with geraniums in the windows. It looked like an island of sanity in his crumbling world. Alex jumped out of the car and without a second thought, ran to the door. He pounded on it with his fists, no longer caring how it looked. After a minute, a light came on inside, and the door opened on its chain. The frightened, sleepy face of Mrs. Gable appeared in the gap. "Who's there? What do you want?" "It's me, Alex Miller," he blurted out, his voice breaking. "We spoke at the library. About the Blackwood house. Please, you have to help me." It got out. Mrs. Gable stared at him for several long, tense seconds. At his crazed eyes, the scratches on his face, his trembling hands. Anyone else in her place would have slammed the door and called the police. But she saw something in his gaze beyond mere madness. She saw genuine, animalistic terror. She slowly closed the door. There was the click of the chain being removed, and the door opened. "Come in," she said quietly. Quickly, Alex stumbled into Eleanor Gable's house, and she immediately shut and locked the door behind him. The contrast was stunning. Outside, a cold night steeped in omnipresent horror. Inside, warmth, comfort, and the smell of old books and chamomile tea. The house was like its owner, neat, orderly, full of a quiet, ancient wisdom. For a moment, Alex felt safe, as if the thick oak door could stop a non-corporeal monster. "Sit down," Mrs. Gable said, pointing to an old armchair by the unlit fireplace. Her voice was calm, but her eyes held deep concern. "I'll put the kettle on. And you, start from the beginning and don't leave anything out." While she bustled in the kitchen, Alex sat, hugging himself, trying to stop shaking. He looked around the room. The walls were lined with bookshelves up to the ceiling. No mirrors. Pictures under glass were turned to face the wall. The surface of the polished coffee table was covered with a thick, knitted cloth. She knew what he was facing, and her home was prepared for it. This realization brought him both relief and a new wave of fear. When she returned with 2 steaming mugs, Alex, stumbling and faltering, told her everything. About finding the workshop. About Silas's journal. About the last entry, the faceless sculpture anchor. About how he had smashed it in desperation and the consequences, how the house came alive, and how the smile now haunted him in every reflection all over town. Eleanor listened in silence, her face growing more and more serious. She didn't interrupt, showed no surprise, only nodding occasionally as if her worst fears were being confirmed. When Alex finished his feverish account and fell silent, leaning back exhaustedly in a chair, she stared into her mug for a long time. "I was afraid of this," she finally said, her voice barely a whisper. "My family, we have lived in Ashworth since its founding. We are not just librarians, Mr. Miller. We are keepers. Keepers of the stories that are not written in the official chronicles. My great-great-grandfather knew the story of Silas Blackwood firsthand. He was one of those who found his empty house." The woman stood up and walked to one of the bookshelves. Pressing on the spine of an inconspicuous book, she opened a secret compartment, from which she retrieved an old leather-bound tome, similar to Silas's journal but much more ancient. "This is my ancestor's journal," she said, placing the book on the table. He and a few of the other town fathers understood that Silas was dealing with more than just ghosts. He had summoned something else. Something my great-great-grandfather called a conceptual parasite. An entity that has no form of its own but can attach itself to an idea, an emotion. Silas gave it an anchor and food, his obsession with joy. As long as the anchor was intact, the entity was trapped in a house, like a genie in a bottle. She opened the book to a bookmark page. There is a crude charcoal drawing, the outline of a house, and inside, a dark blot from which thin web-like threads extended in all directions. You, Mr. Miller, by breaking the anchor, did not kill the genie. You broke the bottle, she continued, her words confirming Alex's worst fear. You released it into the world. Now it is not bound to a place. It is bound to its nature. And its nature is reflection. Any reflection. And it will spread like a virus. Anyone who sees it smile in a mirror, in a shop window, in a puddle after the rain, will become a potential carrier. It will seep into their dreams, into their thoughts, until it drives them mad or forces them to share this joy with others. You have brought a plague to this town, Mr. Miller. A plague of madness. Alex listened to her, and the cold of despair gripped him tighter than the touch of the shadow in the workshop. It was his fault. The entire town, and maybe the whole world, was doomed because of his desperate act. But there must be a way to stop it, he exclaimed. To trap it again. To do something, perhaps. Eleanor turned a page. My ancestors studied entities like this. They cannot be destroyed because they are merely an idea. But an idea can be twisted. Trapped in a paradox. He writes of a mirror of sorrow, a ritual that can create an artifact that reflects not light, but its absence, not joy, but its opposite. Such an object would be unbearable to Silas's entity. It would draw it in like a black hole, but instead of feeding it, it would drain its essence until nothing was left but a void. Hope, faint and fluttering, sparked in Alex's chest. Then let's do it. What does the ritual require? Eleanor Gable raised her old, tired eyes to him, and in their depths, Alex saw an infinite sadness. It requires a new anchor. An object steeped in genuine, deep, irreplaceable loss. And a person. A person willing to sacrifice their happiest memory. To give it to the entity willingly, not as food, but as bait poisoned with grief. The entity will consume it and consume the trap along with it. She paused. You would not just lose the memory of a happy day, Mr. Miller. You would lose the very ability to feel that joy. Forever. Your soul would become a mirror of sorrow. Alex froze, comprehending the full horror of her words. To become an empty vessel devoid of light for the rest of his days. That was the price of salvation. And as he contemplated this monstrous dilemma, outside the window, on the quiet, moonlit street, something changed. In the window of the house across the street, in the dark glass of the living room, a familiar glow began to slowly appear. It formed into a wide, white-toothed, mocking grin. The entity had found them. The sanctuary had fallen, and now it was watching them, patiently awaiting their next move, confident in its victory. The smile in the opposite window grew brighter, sharper. It seemed to be peering into Eleanor's house, studying it, finding its vulnerabilities. Then, like ripples on water, the infection began to spread. A second smile appeared in the adjacent window of the same house. Then a third, in a window on the second floor. Soon, the entire facade of the house across the street had turned into a mocking, many-eyed hydra, staring directly at them. We don't have much time. Eleanor's voice was tense but steady. It's adapting. Learning. Soon it will find a way to get in here, too. Alex tore his gaze from the gruesome sight outside and looked at the elderly woman. There was no fear in her eyes, only determination and a deep, ancient weariness. The decision came on its own. It was terrible, unthinkable, but the only right one. The choice between his personal happiness and the madness of an entire town was clear. I'll do it, he said, and the words sounded firmer than he expected. Eleanor nodded slowly, as if she already knew his answer. Then we must hurry. The ritual requires complete concentration. We will perform it in the cellar. There are no windows there. She walked to the mantelpiece and took down a small, tarnished silver music box. This belonged to my husband. He passed away many years ago. The day he gave it to me, he said its melody was the sound of our love. After he died, I never opened it again. It has been silent for 37 years. I think it holds enough sorrow to be our anchor. She handed the box to Alex. It was cold and heavy, as if filled not with a mechanism, but with frozen tears. "And now she said softly, "you need to choose a memory. The purest, most vivid one you have. The one that warms you in the darkest times. You must see it, feel it, relive it. And when it reaches its peak, you must give it away." Alex closed his eyes. Thoughts raced, but one memory shone brighter than the rest, like a lighthouse in a storm. He was 10 years old. A summer day, a picnic by the lake with his mother. She was still alive, still healthy. The sun filtered through the leaves. Her laughter echoed off the water as he told her some silly joke. He remembered the warmth of her hand, the smell of wildflowers, the taste of a peanut butter sandwich. It was a moment of perfect, serene happiness. A moment when the world was right and full of love. He had replayed this memory in his mind hundreds of times after her death. It was his sanctuary. "I have it," he whispered, opening his eyes, which were filled with tears. They went down to the cellar. Eleanor lit several candles, placing them in a circle on the dusty concrete floor. In the center, she placed the only mirror in the house, a small oval one in a simple wooden frame that she had taken from an old chest. She placed the music box in front of it. From outside, through the thick walls, they could hear a low, deep hum, as if the entire town had begun to vibrate in unison with Silas's laughter. "Stand before the mirror," Eleanor commanded, her voice trembling with strain. "Take the box in your hands. When I begin to read, close your eyes and immerse yourself in your memory. Do not let anything distract you. The entity will try to interfere. It will lie, tempt, and frighten. Ignore it. Just hold on to your joy. And then, let it go." Alex stood in the designated spot, clutching the cold metal of the box. Behind him, Eleanor opened the old tome and began to read. The words were in an unfamiliar, guttural language, vibrating in the air, causing the candle flames to dance wildly. He closed his eyes. At first, there was only darkness. But then, spurred by the ancient words, the image began to form. Sunlight, green grass, the blue surface of the lake. He was there again, feeling the warmth of the sun on his skin, hearing his mother's laughter. Joy pure and untainted began to fill him, pushing out the fear and despair. It felt so real. "She's lying to you," a voice hissed in his head. Silas's voice, cold and insidious. "That is not your memory. It is mine. I will show you true joy. The joy of others' despair." The image of the lake began to fade, replaced by pictures of faces contorted in terror, the same ones he had seen in the workshop. "No," Alex whispered, clinging even tighter to the memory. He saw his mother smile again, felt her embrace. The joy returned, pushing back the nightmarish visions. A deafening crash came from upstairs. The whole house shuddered. The candles went out, plunging the cellar into absolute darkness. But the ritual continued. Eleanor did not falter, her voice growing louder, more insistent. "Fool, you are giving away your greatest treasure. For what in return? Emptiness. Join me. We will laugh together. Forever." Silas's laughter boomed inside his skull, trying to shatter his will. But Alex could barely hear him anymore. He was at the peak. The moment of absolute happiness was here, now. His mother tossing him into the air, he's flying, and the whole world is her laughter, the sun and the blue sky. It was beautiful. And it was his. Now, Eleanor shouted over the roar of the entity raging outside. Alex took a deep breath, savoring the warmth of that day one last time, and then, with a cry that mixed love and agony, he mentally threw his treasure into the darkness. He opened his eyes. The entity was before him. It was no longer just a smile. For a moment, it took form, a vortex of shadows and reflections, at the center of which burned two hungry, insane eyes. It lunged at him, greedily absorbing the offered joy. And the moment it touched him, the trap snapped shut. The music box in his hands glowed white-hot, and from it, instead of a melody, poured a silent scream of pure sorrow. The mirror before him stopped reflecting anything. Its surface darkened, becoming an absolute matte black that began to suck in light, sound, and reality itself. Silas's entity screamed, but it was not a laugh. It was a shriek of unbearable pain. The joy it had consumed, mixed with 37 years of silent grief, had turned to poison. The blackness of the mirror extended its invisible tendrils toward it, and Silas's shadowy form began to distort, stretch, and disintegrate. His face, for a moment becoming almost human, twisted into a grimace of agony that was the polar opposite of his eternal smile. He fought. Waves of pure hatred shook the room. Alex could feel his own joy being torn from him, leaving behind a cold, gaping hole. It wasn't just forgetting. It was erasure. He felt the colors fade, the sounds go silent, the very ability to feel warmth drain out of him. With a final deafening crack that sent hundreds of fractures across the mirror's surface, the entity was completely pulled into the black void, and everything went quiet. The humming stopped. The pressure vanished. The candle flames burned steadily again, illuminating the quiet, dusty cellar. Eleanor was breathing heavily, leaning against the wall. The music box in Alex's hands was cold again. He slowly raised his eyes and looked into the cracked mirror. It was no longer black. It reflected the room, the candles, the old woman. In him, he saw a pale, exhausted man with empty eyes. He brought a hand to his face, tried to make his lips curve upward to remember how it was done. But the muscles wouldn't obey. His face remained a motionless, indifferent mask. He had won. The town was saved. The monster was trapped in a paradox of sorrow. But looking at his own empty reflection, Alex realized the final, most terrible truth. Silas Blackwood had searched for the perfect smile to steal it. And in a way, in the most horrible way imaginable, he had succeeded. He had taken it. Taken it forever.